Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on will the banks join in the Glasgow Agreement. My name is Mannat, Jaspal and I'm an associate fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. And joining me today, we have a very distinguished panel, and now I have the pleasure to briefly introduce them. To start with, we have Ms. Suranjali Tandon. She's an assistant professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and is also a Chevening Financial Services Fellow. She's currently leading the Institute's work for sustainable finance and corporate taxation. We also have Ms. Delfina Lopez, who's the sustainable finance head at the Banco de Nacion, Argentina. Prior to this, Ms. Lopez led the sustainable finance agenda at the G20 during Argentina's presidency in 2018. We have Mr. Rathin Roy. He's the managing director at the Overseas Development Institute. His policy interests and research mainly focus on fiscal and macroeconomic issues in developing and emerging economies. He has previously worked as an economic diplomat and policy advisor at the UNDP and has also served as an economic advisor with the 13th Finance Commission, New Delhi. Last but not the least, we have Professor Saon. She is a professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi. She's an economist with specialization in a wide variety of subjects, including global value chains, FDI, energy, and climate change related issues. A very warm welcome to you all. Before we begin, allow me to very briefly set the context and frame the discussion for today. So the recently concluded 26th Conference of Parties, also known as the Glasgow Climate Pact, did propel nations to ramp up their climate target ambitions. However, where it failed was in raising the climate finance commitments of developed nations commensurate with those transition costs. The 100 billion commitment by developed nations from 2020 is likely to get pushed by a few years, and therefore, all our hopes of driving the net zero transition and saving the planet really hinges on our ability to mobilize global private commercial capital for the green cause. In the words of Boris Johnson, uniting the world's banks and financial institutions behind the global transition to net zero is crucial to unlocking finance we need to get to the net zero target. Allow me to throw in a few statistics here to understand the current context. A report by CPI in 2021 found that 38 of the 60 largest commercial and investment banks had committed to exclude direct financing to coal-fired power plants, yet provided close to 52 billion to the 30 largest coal power plant developers in the world. In fact, Indian banks rank fourth globally in financing coal power plants. Clearly, commercial banks and investment banks are still finding it easier to invest in fossil fuels. So we're really here to discuss what role can the global banks, asset management companies, asset owners, and financial firms play in leading this green movement, and how can they better align their business models to the climate goals. How do we really persuade our commercial and private banks to invest in green infrastructure, green technologies, and green enterprises? In broad strokes, how can the financial system work together to broaden, deepen, and accelerate the transition to a net zero economy, particularly for developing countries? I would like to begin by inviting each of our panelists to make their opening remarks on this broad theme before we really delve into the specifics during the course of this conversation. Ms. Tandon, would you like to start?
Thank you, Mannat. I'd just like to start by saying that banks are in fact an important fulcrum in the entire financial system. If you look at India's banking system, the loans that are outstanding today are to the tune of $1.47 trillion, which is about half the GDP. And then these loans are dispersed to sectors which are prone to transition, partly to coal. And therefore, any movement or any shift away from fossil fuels means that there's a macroeconomic risk impending. And in part, that sort of panned out in the discussions at COP26. There is a recognition that India faces these challenges, and to sort of move away from fossil fuels immediately or drastically is going to have system-wide effects. Having said that, there are risks today as well. So there are sectors which are exposed to extreme weather events, which are now sort of becoming more and more prevalent. And so therefore, I think banks can play an important role, but at the same time must also taper this transition. by sort of creating an agenda for which sectors and what this sort of transition should look like. I'd also like to sort of mention that, even though we say that the transition is coming, it's already underway. So this is underway because of investors and shareholders that are pressuring companies and banks which have cross-border operations to sort of change their portfolio mix. And in that sense, to the question of this panel, which is to say, will banks join Glasgow? Well, of course, they're already unknowingly or knowingly have joined into the transition, but have to be wary of India's needs. In terms of just sort of giving you a sense of what the exposures look like today, the 30% of the loans today are to industry, of which 28% are to transition-prone sectors. So any discussion moving forward must recognize these channels through which the banking system and then the entire economy would be affected. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lopez?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I will be speaking on a personal capacity today, just to share from different perspective of my professional career. I had a few points. One of them is to highlight that indeed the financial community, including the banking industry, have been active, and especially in the past 5 years in terms of making actions for sustainable development and to align their business models. We may discuss, of course, if it was enough, fast enough, robust enough, but action has been there. And we went from an agenda that was about, is it important, is it necessary, to how do we do it, and deep diving into the technicals of it. As a way of reference and taking the leading on the bond market, even during 2020 with the pandemic as a background, there was growth of 1%, I think, of the sustainable, social, and green bonds market. And in that year, there was also that market surpassed the landmark of 1 trillion issuances since cumulative issuances since 2007. That was when the first green bond was issued. So there is action, and that action has been propelled in part by the other component that is not only volume of finance, but the sophistication. We can see in the past years a sophistication in the market in terms of tools, principles, standards, frameworks, data, reports, etc. And one important point is the confluence towards the importance of impact measurement across the board within the financial system. Notwithstanding, it's clear for everyone that what's spending is much bigger. In terms of magnitude, all this growth within the sustainable bond market does not make up to even 1% or 2% of the global market. So at least 98% of the global bond market is not aligned to sustainable development and leads to climate-specific goals. So that's one point to consider. In terms of banks specifically, they have been active, but across the board in terms of the whole spectrum of sustainable finance, meaning two things. One, actions are not necessarily and only focused on climate change. There are social aspects that are being taken care of, the alignment with the SDGs, and the SDGs have different targets, and not all of them are necessarily aligned with climate goals. So that's one aspect that we need to think of, and I think it's relevant for the transition conversation. And the other one is that when we speak about the transformation of the business models of banks or financial industries, but let's take banks, is that one part is their direct impact, if, I don't know, the energy efficiency of the buildings of a bank, for example, and then the impact of the portfolios that they finance. And this aspect has been brought on board later on the road of greening the banking industry. So that's one thing to think of, all these different aspects of the commitments of banks and the financial industry to sustainable development. And three final very small points is we need to take into account and acknowledge the diversity within the financial sector and the banking industry to make sure that our efforts are effective and efficient. We have development banks, we have project finance coming from investment banks, we have retail lending coming from retail banks, and all of them are very different in their possibilities, right? And the third point, the financial industry, and particularly the banking industry, is a highly regulated industry. Excuse me. So regulation and policy signals are crucial. And fourth and final point, retail finance is a sector and a growing sector within the financial industry. And usually we speak about climate finance or sustainable finance, and we don't look into the digital finance agenda, which is growing, and it's even they are even providing. We see fintechs providing lending services, and they're not necessarily in these discussions. So I think that's a fourth important point to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. Mr. Roy, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to make up the gender balance. I want to sort of build actually on what Delfina and Suranjali said to ask a more fundamental initial question, which is why do banks exist? Except in India, where I'm not quite sure what the intended purpose of banking is, given it's all in the public sector, largely so. Banks exist to make money just like anyone else. So the role of banks in green finance is contingent on their being able to make money from green finance. And there's a tension here, speaking of Delfina's point. If you want to regulate the way a profit-making enterprise wants to make money, and the implication of that regulation is you make less money, then you're going to be effectively, that is the same as taxing the shareholders of a bank. Very simple point. So if I can make more money of coal than I can make of renewables, but then the central bank regulates me saying you can't invest in coal, then I'm making less money for the shareholders. Now, the response in Glasgow and other places like that is banks are stupid. They don't realize that there's risk in investing in coal. And therefore, these assets that they investigate could become stranded. Right? On the other hand, and I'm going to be I hope that Delfina will agree with me, the history of stranded assets, including in the 2008 financial crisis, has been that the taxpayer pays for them. When have stranded assets ever caused a bank to tank without a bailout from any government? The UK government, the French government, the Argentinian government, and the Indian government every 12 years. So ultimately, then the bailout comes from the taxpayer. So there's a genuine, and this is serious economics. It's not about one planet and all that. We have to really start doing some serious economics. And I was very disappointed at Glasgow to see, and I completely agree with Delfina, how vague the conversations were. There is a moral hazard problem here. And I do not see. So when I met Mark Carney at Glasgow, and I met the executive director in charge of climate, I asked him, why are you holding commercial paper? Do you know the Bank of England, the Bank of Finland, because of the financial crisis, actually hold assets of private sector companies? And they said, oh, that's a legacy from the financial crisis. I said, but now you are looking at them to justify how green you are. And you're saying you'll buy private commercial paper on the basis of how green you are. So you see, there's a huge confusion both in the minds of the regulator and the banking system about exactly what a green transition means. I'm not a communist. So for a communist, it's very simple. You have a green transition, you have a plan to achieve it, you go and get the money. That's Soviet Union, maybe China. That's not how the capitalist system works. That's not how a free market works. So I think there needs to be a lot more clarity when we ask the question, how can we get banks to finance a green transition? Because the straight answer is they'll finance it if it makes money for them. And if that money at the risk-reward profile of that matches the risk-reward profile that is optimal. If it does not match that, then they will not invest in it unless they are forced to invest in it. But if they're forced to invest in it, then they will make less money for their shareholders, which is a bad thing, or there will be a default. How do you control for that? It's very difficult. But I must right at the outset say that, ideas, and it's my final point, ideas like interest rate subventions, which are very popular with climate warriors, I am not in favor of them. I'm not in favor of priority sector lending. I was never in favor of forcing banks, and we all criticized it. We said these are horrible socialist habits. Now, suddenly, the West is becoming socialist. I'm very amused and saying, let's give credit more cheaply to people in climate because they're nice people. Well, why not give credit more cheaply to people who are poor because they're nice people or because they're more needy people? So I think we need a lot of clarity between the notion that a bank is there to lend finance consistent with the theory of efficient markets and to maximize its profits and thereby maximize collective prosperity, and the ifs and buts that the climate people are bringing in simply because it's not working. You will get the banks to invest huge amounts, I predict, in this country behind Ambani and Adani on hydrogen. They're going to do it because they want to save the planet. They're going to do it because Ambani and Adani are good credit risks. They're putting the money where their mouth is. The banks will follow. So if that is the model, then we shouldn't be having a conversation about banks. Banks will follow where the profits are. And if investing in renewables is profitable, then banks will be there. Thanks.
Thank you. You make some very valid points there. Professor Ray, would you like to set the stage and give your opening remarks, please?
Thank you, Mannat. I think I can come in at a very interesting point in the conversation. And what I'd like to just add is that basically banks need a bankable project. A project, particularly for infrastructure, this has been a problem, particularly in the case of India, that the infrastructure projects were not often bankable. And just taking off from what Dr. Roy was saying, how do banks basically embed climate financial risk into their supervisory approach, central banks particularly? How do they differentiate between physical risk and transition risk? How do they still adhere to the principles of responsible banking? And then go on to do other things like, the core functions that they already had, like providing financial stabilities as societies move increasingly in reducing the carbon footprint. How do they diversify investment, knowing that there are risks of particularly uncertainty risks? And how do they actually provide support to the global effort to reach the Paris Accord or the what has been achieved in Glasgow? So for all this, while it is an opportunity for banks, there is a long way to go, particularly because even the standards or the definitions for green finance are not very clear at the moment, and they are still evolving. And the basic question for banks is that as long as there are brown assets which are profitable, will they actually finance green projects? And as green projects become more and more profitable, maybe only then we'll see the tide turning. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad we've touched upon all the important critical areas during this quick remark round. I'll start with a couple of questions. So my first question would be on lending. So that's for Professor Ray. We've all agreed that banks are transitioning away from operational and attributable GHG emissions and lending towards more net zero aligned investments. But in India, particularly, what can banks and financial institutions do to accelerate green financing rather of sustainable businesses like, say, electric vehicles or sustainable waste management, coastal resilience? And what structural changes do you think are required to be made in the traditional lending approaches for them to undertake this role?
Thank you. I think one needs to understand the problem at the moment that EV firms particularly are facing in financing some of the projects. Only big firms are being able to find funds. This is, of course, a general problem. Not only the EV sector, other sectors also face this. There are problems as far as counter guarantees are concerned. This being a very niche and a nascent sector, often the counter guarantees are not available. So what can be done essentially? One, of course, is this idea has been mooted often that the EV sector could come under the ambit of priority sector lending. But there are some other ideas that also have come. For example, that there could be one needs a bond market, basically a green bond market, and one has talked about it could be very specific maybe to the sector, but that will obviously evolve as time. There could be a dedicated clean financial energy a finance institution, but you will be again adding to the myriad of institutions that already exist. So I don't know how that might work. And there is a great role that state financial corporations can play, because much of the EV in India is being led by the states and state policies. So there is a very, very important role for state financial organizations. Now, as far as the problem that small firms, etc., are facing, the size, credit history, etc., as well as the counter guarantee. These are problems that, because the sector is new, banks need to understand. They need to devise, banks and financial institutions need to devise projects or products which are going to address the issues, particularly of this sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ray. Ms. Tandon, I'll move to you now. In your opening remarks, you spoke about how reallocation of credit from carbon-intensive sectors to less intensive sectors is already taking place to a certain extent. So in the process, do you feel how can we avoid issues of greenwashing or green bubbles because of making this transition? There are a lot of concerns that have come up around green bubbles that may be the next because of a lot of sustainable bonds that have been used. So how can we avoid these kind of issues going forward, particularly in India?
Yeah, Mana, that's a fair point, because if you look at the green bond space or the ESG investments, which are not necessarily in the banking system, they are issued on a promise of achieving certain targets. Now, in the green bond space, there is a certification process available. There are, companies like the Big Four that's supposed to go and check for compliance. But for any regulation, there is an experience of behavior which is not in line with what the regulation aspires to do, and you will always see that happening. Whether it's for the green market or any other. As far as greenwashing is concerned, I think the only example that I came across, and perhaps the other panelists can pitch in, is in the UK, where they have a new sort of regulation by the Competition Markets Authority. Now that looks at companies which promise that there are products which are green, and it allows the authority to go back and check whether the promise was really accurate. And in the last couple of years, we've also seen class action suits against companies which have made a certain promise and not lived up to them. So I think there are ways and means to sort of tackle what we call greenwashing. But I'm a little bit of a pessimist to say that you can keep drawing the line in the sand, which is your defining your regulations, which again are a function of how you define green over a period of time. And people will tend to shift their behavior in order to tap that money. It's essentially got linked with where the profits are, and how investors respond to these profits. So there are limits to tackling greenwashing.
Understood. Thank you. And I think in this regard, taxonomies and having reporting structures play a very important role. So, Ms. Lopez, in the current form, climate finance reporting information is really very incomplete, inconsistent, and incomparable. And we know how much investors, lenders, and insurers really rely on data to make informed decisions around capital allocation and risk underwriting. How do you think we can enhance climate-related financial disclosures in the banking industry, particularly in developing countries which don't have a standardized taxonomy and reporting frameworks to go by?
Thank you for the question. So a few points. One of them is that as all these instruments and tools and resources have been developed, the sophistication of the market includes a trend in sophistication of reporting. We are seeing that back in the days, not far away, but a few years ago, reporting started to be more common, but still it was about more of on results and performance, meaning how much has been allocated to what project, but it didn't go into impact measurement. This is something that initially was something more distinctive within the impact investment community, but has grown to be more common or at least a demand to be more common within the whole of the among the financial players. And I think that's one trend that is already taking shape that is important, because as we start measuring actual impact, we can make better decisions. We really know what money is working, what money is not working, what is missing, what is not missing, what are the best instruments for which type of projects. So I think that's one thing that is important, and that will allow for but reporting to be more complete. That's one point. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight. It's something that builds over time, because let's say one bank issues their first report, it will come out a bit rusty. The second one will be better. The third one will be better, because reporting has to be understood, at least in how I think, it has to be understood in rapport or in dialogue with the actual actions, right? You land, you measure, you report, you learn, then you learn, and then you can better lend. So that's one point. The other point is that more as the sustainable bond industry market started to grow, we're starting to see frameworks popping up, right? As banks and financial institutions have their frameworks, which have also improved in sophistication since the first ones to now, we start understanding what has to be measured. And when you start understanding what has to be measured, you start adjusting the procedures, internal procedures. Because to measure impact, maybe you need variables or indicators that you were not measuring, that you didn't even think of measuring. And now, as you see that, you start adjusting your internal processes to start measuring. So I think there's this rapport between having frameworks that understand what's the core of the bank or the institution, how better use their type of capital, if it's lending, if it's venture capital, if it's project finance, how to better use their type of capital, and then measure, and that will measure and then report, of course, and reporting usually is public. So I think that's something that's going to improve reporting and will make it more comparable. The other piece is that these frameworks usually there's a tendency of these frameworks to relate or make reference to more global or international standards, let's say. For example, if I follow the green bond principles, and that starts making some standardization somehow, some level playing field, or using common concepts and categories, and that will allow for greater comparability. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. I'll come to you, Mr. Roy, now. You have the vantage point of being, also the geographical proximity of, to Glasgow and being in the UK and in the public policy space, and you worked in the developed and the developing nations. So, closer to the COP, there was a global coalition. There was a global coalition of leading financial institutions called the GFANZ, which was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And the primary objective of that was to bring together financial sector to accelerate transition to net zero economy. Now, one of the initiatives under this is called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which has close to about 95 banks from 39 countries and hold almost 43% of global banking assets. Neither India nor Argentina is part of this alliance today. So, firstly, my question to you is: how effective do you think these alliances are in, routing capital to developing countries? And secondly, why are nations like India and Argentina not part of the alliance? And what challenges do you think they face in being able to join a coalition of this scale and size?
Thank you. That's a very important question. I've written about it. Not about the alliance, but about the entire concept of net zero, which I think is a scam. And I would urge young people listening to this to be very careful of this scam. Net zero is an arithmetic number, a bit like the multiplier in macroeconomics. It tells you nothing about how you achieve it. When I used to teach macroeconomics, I'm a macroeconomist by training. In England back in the day, 25 years ago, I used to tell people that the multiplier is indifferent to the morality of economic expansion. You could build a bunch of, sort of drugstores and brothels and achieve a certain rate of growth, or you could invest in education and health and achieve a certain rate of growth. The point for a macroeconomist is we are indifferent. Net zero is like that. And the developing countries, especially India, just before we announced our net zero target, kept saying it is not the concept of net zero that is as important as you guys are fetishizing. It is the pathways to net zero. And there are many pathways to net zero. But what I think is happening is that both banks and developed country institutions are, I'll give you an example in a second, are trying to lock us into their chosen net zero pathway. And we have all fallen into this trap to some extent in this conversation. What makes it incumbent upon me to choose electric vehicles as a mode of green? Why can I not have a world where people drive less and bicycle more? Will that not be suitable to India, and therefore you build cycle pathways and not quadrilateral highways, etc., etc., etc.? That's a transportation choice which is significantly green. And as a byproduct of that choice, you will get net zero. But what you're seeing, and what I think the developed country banking institutions are collaborating in, is an attempt to say that the consumption patterns that we see today will not change. We are going to get net zero having the same consumption patterns and therefore the same production patterns. In other words, I think, Delfina, you said this, there is a direct conflict between SDG 16, which is production and consumption patterns, and the desire to achieve a carbon-free, does not mean net zero automatically, to reduce carbon or global warming to less than 1.5 degrees or whatever. So if the banks are going to choose what we consume and therefore decide to invest in what we produce, without a discussion on alternative pathways, it would be wrong of India and Argentina and extremely irresponsible of the developing countries as a whole to collaborate in this hoax of net zero. This was the reason why, I'll tell you in confidence, when I was asked informally by the Indians, this business of 2070, what shall we do? I said, it doesn't matter, just make sure it's 10 years after China. One, it's not verifiable. Two, we're only doing it because they're pestering us to do it. Because we did say, on October 24th, India said, the pathways are more important, official statement. It was ignored by the climate warriors. So this fixation on net zero is very unhealthy. And the very nomenclature of this banking initiative is not, towards better financing for a zero carbon, even that would be okay, future, or a 1.5 degree future. It's towards a net zero future, which means how we achieve it, we have decided. Hydrogen plus electric vehicles, not agriculture plus other things. And that is the reason why I think there is a fundamental dissonance, which is being brushed under the carpet very sadly by so-called climate warriors, between the political economy of the developed country position and the developing country position. And I really would ask that you reflect on this a little more, those who work in the climate space. And for once, I think the government of India has taken a progressive stand here and we should support it.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I just want to build up on what you've said right now. You've spoken about, how net zero isn't as effective a policy measure. But we know that the physical and transition risks of climate change will have devastating impacts on macroeconomic indicators like price stability, inflation control, labor dynamics, etc. And you didn't seem to be a great proponent of RBI categorizing renewable energy as a priority sector lender, as in the lending sector. Sorry. So in that regard, how do you think that the central banks and what kind of regulation do you feel like they can do, and what market signals do you feel like they should be putting out there to incentivize banks to lend more, with keeping in mind the profitability objective of the banking and financial sector?
See, this is the entire problem. There's a huge analytical confusion here. Till 2 years ago, we were all against priority sector lending. It was horrible. We were giving money to these poor farmers. That's why we brought in the farm laws, right? It's a bad thing. Priority sector lending is bad. It creates crony capitalism. Suddenly, we are talking about priority sector lending for green, as if it suddenly become a virtuous force. One. Two, you said something very interesting just now. You said, how does the central bank provide market signals? Since when is it the job of a central bank to provide market signals? I'm not a communist. And I'm really, really concerned at the kind of proto-communist language that is creeping into the entire climate space. Regulators cannot provide signals. So my short answer to that is, regulators like central bank can do three things. Now, it's not to say that they have not done it. The Indian central bank has not particularly been crony capitalist. But if you go to the Bank of England, you go to the Bank of Finland, anywhere, the very fact that they are holding private sector commercial paper as part of their asset portfolio violates one of the basic tenets of central banking. And they've done it because capitalism in these countries was in trouble. So their first job is to maintain stability in the capitalist system, and that's fine. But if you're going to maintain stability in the capitalist system and protect capitalist system, then you've got to tell me what it is that you are regulating when you tell a bank to invest in sector X and not in sector Y. If the investment in, let's say, coal is at scale and that causes macroeconomic risks for India, then working back from that, you would quantify those macroeconomic risks. And the biggest macroeconomic risk would be that coal will be declared a stranded asset. And to that extent, I'm just walking you through something very briefly. Foreign direct investment would not come to India because they're anticipated. Then you have two options. You do not welcome foreign direct investment into coal. You welcome it somewhere else, for which you would need to demonstrate, optically at least, that you are providing regulations that allow people to make good returns from hydrogen and other renewable investments. That's the energy space. That's very easily done. I think a reasonable taxonomy of what is and what is not a good sector, and combined with good business planning, good credit analysis, and a reasonable differential in risk weighting is something that central banks can do, and in fact, private credit rating agencies can also do. It's not rocket science. Going beyond that, to talk about, I'll give you an example and then stop, to talk about the portfolios that central banks hold as being green, I think is a bit of a scam. There are lots of scams in this business. I just recently read the Bank of England sustainability report. Okay, it's about 300 pages long. 200 pages talks about switching off the lights in the Bank of England building. Now, if that's the conversation we're having, I think Delfina pointed this out, which is what banks can do to go green by switching off their lights. Good luck. I'm not really interested. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm not interested in, what vegetarian food you eat in your building and what lights you switch off and switch on. For the rest, the Bank of England looked at their portfolio of holdings and they said 94% of our holdings are of British government securities. And because the British government is a green government, our portfolio is green. That's all. No more. There was no other methodology, no metrics. All you guys are data driven. I'm not. No data. You love data, right? No data. It just said lots of data on how British government bonds are deployed only for green purposes because the British government had a policy on not being green. Therefore, what central banks should then do, but then you see the counterfactual doesn't work. The RBI has to lend to the government of India, however dirty the government of India's lending is. The Bank of England will have to lend to the government to the UK government, however dirty the lending is. So therefore, to talk about the role of central banks in regulating the flow of credit to their principal client, which is governments, always remember. Central banks lend principally to governments, is limited. With banking supervision, what they can do, I think my colleagues have already said, they can make sure that no one's cheating, just like any other business. And they can make sure that the risk officers are fully aware of the risks of investing in brownfield and, sort of not net zero friendly projects or not carbon friendly projects, because the whole world is going to come to them like a ton of bricks. And that's really all they can do. I'm not a big fan of central banks being active more than they are even now. I'd say less active they should be in the climate space. They have more important work to do, like making sure inflation is under control and that the macroeconomy is stable. And this should be really left to fiscal policy, to government policy, and overall, which is the same as saying that if you wanted to have an industrial policy in a country, I wouldn't expect the central bank to do it. I'd expect the central bank to coordinate with government, but industrial policy is not made in the Ministry of Finance or the Reserve Bank of India. It's made in the Department of Industry. So likewise, climate policy and how to get to net zero is not made in the RBI or in the Ministry of Finance. All we can do is make sure that we are able to complement government directives on the matter by providing complementary finance. But then if it conflicts with other objectives of government, which is to make the entire banking system more market friendly, remove priority sector lending, then I must point out that there are contradictions.
Right. Thank you for that, Mr. Roy, for your very articulated, strong views on the matter. We'll actually now, in the interest of time, we just have about a couple of minutes left. And we've had like a wide range of ideas and opinions and thoughts. So I think I'd really like to go to each of the panelists, and maybe if you want to take 30 seconds to give some final remarks, and if you want to touch upon something that we haven't as yet, or if you want to pass a comment on a fellow panelist's views and ideas and supplement that, or argue that, please feel free to. So I'll start with Professor Ray. Any last 30 seconds closing remarks, please?
Thank you, Mannat. I think the most important thing is to understand how we are addressing risk and how we are quantifying, measuring risk, and moving on to a pathway where with those identified risks. I'll stop here.
Thank you for that brief and very appropriate remark. Ms. Tandon?
Yeah, I'll make quick comments. I think very valid points here. When you look at a net zero plan, it's just sort of a blanket target, but to work backwards on not just what producers have to do, but also what consumers will have to do requires, I think, thinking from elsewhere, not the central banks. But having said that, central banks are in the business of pricing risks in terms of judging what the inflationary impacts will be, even from suggestions such as carbon taxes, which are now being handed out as a panacea for decarbonizing. So I think central banks can help stress test the system, can help price the risk, so that producers and consumers can then make choices about where this transition is headed, and then to inform policy.
Thank you. Ms. Lopez?
Yes, thank you. So I would say two big last comments. One is that it's not only about regulation. Regulation works in tandem as well with policy. And in terms of policy, we need to clean up. There are cross incentives, there are subsidies that are inefficient or incorrect for this goal, I would say. So we need to clean up the policy signals to work better. And that, of course, there are many interests that may collide, but there are also costs. And speaking specifically for some sectors or for some countries that may have huge, bigger hurdles for the financing, I would say that not all losers are responsible. And that's one piece to consider when we judge that we should simply do more. We need to understand what is doing more and understand what are the right actions. And in understanding that not all losers are responsible, I think that it's important to highlight three instruments that I think have potential in the future. Sustainably linked instruments, be loans, bonds. Transition bonds may be also useful, and general use of proceeds. And the reason why I highlight these ones is because are the ones that can help transform SMEs, help transform sector, help transform infrastructure, etc. And related to this, and maybe the final point, is that we need to focus the efforts in making sure, I think it's more about what ceases to be good business than just putting money into something that is good. Because as long as we have that is good, but we also have all the rest of the sectors or practices that contribute, to, generally speaking, contamination, we would still have a broken system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. Mr. Roy, any last thoughts?
Just a couple. Keep the conversation focused on pathways and not on the net zero target, and therefore regulation and policy should reflect decisions on pathways. That is both more inclusive of climate justice and brings in the wider stakeholder community, and therefore prevents what is happening now, which is central banks and the financial system talking as if the climate problem can be solved in a silo in which they belong. Second is very simply let the central bank focus on its core mandate, which is inflation control and macroeconomic stabilization. And to the extent that climate risk impacts that mandate, let the central bank justify why and how it is going to intervene to mitigate climate risk. Let us not make the most capitalist of all systems, the financial and banking sector, advocates for a public cause. Capitalism doesn't work that way. We're going to fall flat and fail. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to conclude, climate diplomacy and global cooperation will be the underpinning for leading the green transformation. And we must bear in mind that the interplay between global climate policies and climate financial regulation must balance the twin goal of ensuring financial resilience for banks and ensuring sustainable investments. Thank you to our panelists for making the time to join us today. And thank you to all our viewers for joining.